Do you want more gains in the gym, an easier time with fat loss, more energy throughout the day, and a dramatically lower risk for nearly every major disease? And if you answered that yes, then you want better insulin sensitivity. So in this video, we're going to talk about insulin sensitivity and insulin resistance, why it's so important, how to figure out if you're insulin resistant, because most people get this wrong, and exactly what you can do to improve your insulin sensitivity with nutrition, exercise, biohacking, and then what people love the most, supplements and drugs. At the end of this video, I'm going to give you a simple game plan to supercharge your cells and become more insulin resistant so you can live a better life. Okay, so let's get into it. And by the way, my name is Andrew Martin. I'm a human biologist and a health and performance advisor, and I help high performers optimize their health so they can live at their full potential for a very, very long time. You may have heard that insulin resistance is a cause of weight gain, low energy, and several chronic health conditions like diabetes, but you might not be 100% sure what insulin is, what insulin sensitivity means, or what insulin resistance means. And so let's start there. First, insulin. Insulin is a hormone that's released by your pancreas in response to rising blood sugar, which is glucose. Blood sugar, glucose, same thing, okay? So when you eat carbohydrates, the carbs are going to get broken down into glucose, and then your pancreas releases insulin. Insulin then binds to the receptors on the surface of liver, muscle, and fat cells, and that triggers a cascade of events that ultimately lead to moving something called glucose transporters to the surface of the cell. Okay, so insulin binds to the cell, inside the cell stuff happens, and then glucose transporters come outside to the surface of the cell. Okay, what happens is those glucose transporters then can take glucose and blood sugar that's in your blood and bring it into the cell. So it's moving glucose from outside the cell to in it, right? An easy way to think about this is that insulin is basically the key that unlocks the cell so that glucose can come inside. Once glucose is inside the cell, one of three things happen. Glucose is either used for energy immediately, glucose is converted into glycogen, in which case it's stored in the liver and the muscles so that it can be used for quick energy at a later date. And lastly, the third thing that can happen is that if there's too much glucose and all of those stores in your muscles and your liver are full, then the glucose gets stored as body fat to be used for energy much, much later. Obviously, we want that to happen a lot less. So having good insulin sensitivity means that your body only needs a small amount of insulin to effectively clear glucose blood sugar from the blood and get it to its proper location. And this is a really good thing because it's going to keep your energy stable, it's going to reduce inflammation, and it's going to improve metabolic efficiency. Now, insulin resistance, on the other hand, is when the receptors that insulin binds to stop responding well to insulin. They basically just stop listening to it. And this is sort of like if you were going to go put the key in the door, but it doesn't fit quite right, and you like jam it in there, but then the lock won't turn, and everyone's behind you is waiting outside, and it's super cold outside, and everyone's miserable, and it's just not good. Okay, so you have sugar in the blood, and your body makes insulin. But then your receptors are like, nah, we're all good here. Like, we have enough sugar inside. We're all set. And so what happens is blood sugar, glucose, continues to build up in the blood, right? And that's what happens with insulin resistance. It leads to high blood sugar because we're not able to absorb that sugar anymore, okay? Why does this matter, though? Well, insulin resistance doesn't just lead to diabetes, Alzheimer's, cardiovascular disease, cancer, PCOS, infertility. It does all those things, but it can also lead to obesity, difficulty gaining muscle, low energy, brain fog, skin tags, headaches, muscle cramps, poor recovery. I mean, the list goes on. And so if you're someone who cares about your performance, physical or cognitive, then you're going to want to, and you want to operate at your absolute best, then you have to be insulin sensitive. It has to be a top priority. And so the question is, how do you know if you're actually insulin sensitive? Well, let's dive into that, okay? So how do you properly assess your insulin sensitivity? You've probably had your blood sugar tested, but the truth is that it's not enough. So here's how we actually assess insulin sensitivity. On a basic level, you can do fasting glucose, and an optimal range for fasting glucose would be 75 to 85 milligrams per deciliter. This is the most common assessment by far, and it's done at your annual physical, and it's super important, but it doesn't tell the whole story. And for a number of reasons, but number one is that, the traditional range here is between 70 and 99 is the normal range. 100 to 126 is considered pre-diabetic, and then 126 plus is considered diabetic. But we know the optimal range is better than that, right? It should be 75 to 85. For A1C, which is the second assessment, which is also very common, the optimal range is 4.6 to 5.3. And basically what that's doing is averaging your blood glucose over the last 90 to 120 days and figuring out like what's it on average been over the last 90 days, right? The regular range goes up to 5.6, but it's just too high, right? We want to be between 4.6 and 5.3. Over than that, it does suggest some form of insulin resistance. And the last thing here, one of the last things here is fasting insulin. Okay, and so the fasting insulin reference range is way bigger. On a standard lab test, it's going to be between 2 and 20. But we know that we want to be between 2 and 5, so it would be a lot lower than that, right? And the higher your fasting insulin, the more likely that you are to have insulin resistance. I said that was the last one. It's not. There's another one. Triglycerides to HDL ratio is another assessment that you can get that, you have your triglycerides and your cholesterol done at any major, physical or doctor visit. So you can use these ratios, even though they don't tell you what they are. You can do the math in your head and figure out if you, are likely to have insulin resistance. And so what we do is we take your triglycerides and divide it by your HDL, and we want that to be, under 1.5 to 1. Okay, the ratio should be 1.5 triglycerides to 1 HDL. Okay, that would be optimal. Over 2 to 1 is strongly correlated with insulin resistance. Okay, so we don't want to be that. Okay. Now, a more advanced assessment for insulin resistance is something called HOMA-IR. It's the homeostatic model assessment of insulin resistance. This is like one of the easiest ways you can get a much more advanced assessment. And what's cool about it is it doesn't take a lot of information. All that we need is your fasting insulin and your fasting glucose. And if we have that, then we can measure this. Okay. So you take your fasting insulin and you multiply it by your fasting glucose, and then you divide by 405. And that's how you get your HOMA-IR score. Okay. An elite HOMA-IR score would be under 1, and then optimal would be between like 1 and 1.2, 1.2 to 1.5 would be sufficient, and then over 1.5, you're insulin resistant. There's some degree of that going on. Now, the HOMA-IR indicates how much insulin is required to maintain your fasting glucose. Now, this is important because a lot of people have great blood sugar, and so they think they're fine, but they're actually still insulin resistant. Okay, which is crazy. But if you don't have these two metrics to kind of use to compare against each other, then you don't have enough information to really determine if you are insulin sensitive or not. So let's show the math here on two different people. Person number 1 has a fasting insulin of 5 and a fasting glucose or blood sugar of 90. So you take 5 times 90, you get 450. And then you divide that 450 by 405, and that's how you get their HOMA-IR, which is 1.11. Now, this person is not likely to have insulin resistance. But person number 2 has an insulin of 10, and a fasting glucose that's even better than person number 1 at 85. So you take 10 times 85, we get 850, divide by 405, and their HOMA-IR score is 2.1. And they are insulin resistant. And what's crazy is, they have a lower blood sugar than the person number 1. And so this is why it's important to get a more deep, thorough assessment of what's going on. There are other markers that, in tests that you can use too. C-peptide, the more advanced HOMA-2 assessment, HOMA-B, something called a HEC with a hyperinsulinemic euglycemic clamp, which is actually the gold standard, but it's really tough to find a place to do it. Okay, so quick pause. If you want to find out where you stand with your insulin sensitivity and what might be holding you back, a good place to start is our cellular blueprint assessment. We're going to ask a series of questions around 15 categories of your health, grade your systems, and then I'll personally review your results and help you determine the best place for you to focus. Also, if you're interested in a more advanced assessment with specialty labs and testing, then you'll have the opportunity to schedule a consultation thereafter. So if you want to go through that, the link is in the description if you're ready to go deeper. Okay, so let's get to the strategies for how to actually improve your insulin sensitivity. Okay, let's say you are insulin resistant to some degree, which a lot of people are. What do we actually do about it? Well, the first overarching bucket that we're going to discuss is nutrition. So nutrition strategies for improving insulin sensitivity are fairly misunderstood, right? We know that ketogenic diets, which are very low in carbohydrates, help improve metrics of insulin resistance, like your fasting glucose and insulin. However, some people argue that improved glucose and insulin don't actually mean that you're more sensitive to insulin. It just means that you have less sugar in the blood because you're eating less carbohydrates, right? So personally, I think, we have the research available, and I do think it's a smart idea to reduce carbohydrate intake if your goal is improving your insulin sensitivity, and especially those high glycemic, high processed carbs like candy, pasta, bread, sodas, etc. Those things are going to, across the board, decrease your insulin sensitivity and increase your risk for insulin resistance. What's interesting, though, is that we know that high-fat diets can also cause insulin resistance. You may be thinking, that's weird. I thought you just said keto improves our blood sugar, and maybe even your doctor said, "Hey, you're insulin resistant. You should try keto. They might have recommended it to you." Well, it turns out that might not be the best idea depending on how you go about it. Okay, and so keto is an all-fat diet, right, or primarily fat diet, and they do improve insulin sensitivity. So how could both of these things be true? Where the high-fat diet can cause insulin resistance, but keto reduces insulin resistance, right? And it's primarily made up of dietary fats. So what's really going on here is that a high-fat diet, when combined with carbohydrates, is the problem. And so if you're doing true keto and you don't have carbohydrates in the picture at all, then it does improve your insulin sensitivity. The problem is that keto is really hard to stick to. And so most people who end up trying it just end up doing this modified version where, they are in ketosis sometimes, but sometimes they aren't because they're not compliant, and they give into something that is filled with carbohydrates, right? And then they end up eating a diet that's high in both fats, like keto, and carbohydrates, and they end up in the worst possible position, that we can think of as it relates to insulin sensitivity. So you don't want to do that, obviously. If you can stick to keto, it may be a good solution, but I think there are probably better ways, okay? And we're going to get into those. We do know that getting enough protein and fiber does improve your insulin sensitivity and markers of metabolic health. Part of this is probably because both fiber and protein slow down digestion and the absorption of carbohydrates, so you get this long release of sugar into the bloodstream rather than a quick hit of it, and a quick aggressive spike in your blood sugar that makes it hard for insulin to do its job. And part of this is because the number one thing that you can do to improve insulin sensitivity is lose weight. And high protein and high fiber diets tend to help us lose weight. Okay, it's pretty simple. So you definitely want to be getting enough protein. A good target again is half your body weight in ounces. I'm sorry, that's a hydration target. A good protein target is to get a gram per pound of body weight. Right now, that may be aggressive if you're overweight, but let's say you're 200 pounds. Generally, trying to get close to 200 grams of protein, and then fiber somewhere between 20 and 40 grams of fiber. Okay. Next strategy for nutrition is intermittent fasting. People love to talk about it, right? It's very popular, but it has been shown to improve insulin sensitivity even without weight loss, okay? So aside from weight loss, it can make you more insulin sensitivity. This is especially true if your feeding window is in the morning, which is probably rare. Personally, I don't think it's a very realistic strategy to do intermittent fasting where you eat in the beginning of the day and then fast at the end of the day. But we do know that the research tells us that is optimal. I just think that you're not going to eat breakfast and lunch and then skip dinner because all of the social things you'll miss out on, and it'll just be pretty miserable to go out to dinner with friends and not get to eat, right? That's just my opinion, maybe. But all to be said, intermittent fasting does increase insulin sensitivity, and especially if it's morning time feeding, which we're going to get into a little bit more later, okay? So do what you want. Now, as far as specific foods that you can use that can help, number one, fatty fish that are high in omega-3s like salmon can improve insulin sensitivity. We know that. Number two, foods that are high in antioxidants like berries and leafy greens. Those are great. And number three, since probiotics have been shown to reduce fasting glucose, A1C, and HOMA-IR, eating fermented foods that are rich in probiotics like yogurt, sauerkraut, and kimchi are also a good idea. Lastly, with nutrition here, the order in which you eat your food can make a difference too. And so, if you have a plate of food, you want to eat your fibrous foods first, and then your protein, and then your carbohydrates. For reasons that we talked about before, you're going to slow down the absorption of glucose into the bloodstream, so you get this more gradual rise in blood sugar versus that, quick hit, that quick spike. It's going to make it just easier for your body to handle, okay? So if you got a plate of food with broccoli, chicken, and sweet potato, right? You're going to want to eat your broccoli, and then your chicken, and then your sweet potato, ideally for insulin sensitivity purposes, okay? All right. That's basics for nutrition. Let's move on to exercise. This gets me fired up, okay? Because resistance training reigns king again. And that makes me happy because I love lifting weights. But lifting weights obviously help you build muscle mass. That's especially true if your nutrition is dialed in. Who doesn't want to build muscle, and get some biceps? But aside from looking like a Greek god or goddess, whichever you decide to be here, your muscles are the primary site for glucose uptake. Okay, so the more muscle that you have, the more glucose that you can store, which means that it's not in your bloodstream. Good thing. Okay. On the other hand, cardiovascular exercise is better at increasing the activity of those glucose transporters that we talked about earlier. So basically, when you start contracting a muscle, these receptors come to the surface of the cell and allow glucose to come in. Okay, so cardiovascular exercise is very good at that. In strength training and in exercise that builds muscle is better at long term, giving that glucose a place to be stored. Okay, so both types of these exercise improve insulin signaling pathways. They reduce fat oxidation within the muscle. They improve mitochondrial function. Basically, they help the body become way more efficient at using glucose, making it less likely for your blood sugar to spike. Okay, and again, the best approach is going to be using both resistance training and cardiovascular training, with resistance training providing the long-term benefit and the cardiovascular exercise providing the benefit today. Okay, better glucose utilization today. Another great exercise strategy for insulin sensitivity is something called exercise snacks. So basically, a group of researchers wanted to know that if short bursts of exercise several times sporadically throughout the day was more effective at improving cardiometabolic health metrics like glucose and insulin than a single bout of exercise, say, right? And it turns out that if you do 6 1-minute bursts of exercise split over the course of the day, then it is actually more effective at improving markers of metabolic health and insulin resistance than being sedentary all day and then performing a 1-hour bout of exercise. That's pretty cool because anyone can do a minute of exercise, right? And we believe that this is because, the intensive exercise bouts that are, more frequent deplete the muscles of stored glycogen. They activate insulin signaling pathways. And they bring those glucose receptors that we talked about twice now to the surface of the cell several times throughout the day. So they just keep coming to the surface of the cell and keep bringing in more glucose so you have less in your blood. And personally, I love this strategy because it's just so easy to implement. You can't say you don't have enough time to exercise for 1 minute. Okay? Everyone's got 1 minute at some point to do this, and you could do that a few times per day. So just pick a movement you can perform with a lot of intensity and do it for a minute. Some good options here. I've got a treadmill over here, right? I can go for a quick sprint. I wouldn't recommend that for injury risk purposes, but maybe an assault bike or a rower, incline treadmill, like walking very fast, right? If with a weight vest, maybe that might be a little bit restricted, but burpees, running up and down the stairs, jump rope. Anything that you can spend a lot of energy very quickly and put a lot of intensity into it, right? Air squats are a good one as well. That's exercise. So we want to do our resistance training, we want to do some cardiovascular training, some kind of blend of the two, and then exercise snacks are a great strategy as well, okay? Moving on to the next bucket here, which is habits and biohacking, okay? Now, the two main lifestyle habits that will send you into insulin resistance like no tomorrow are sleep and stress, and specifically poor sleep and high stress, right? If either of those are out of control, it's going to be very, very hard for you to be insulin sensitive. I can't overstate how important these are. I really can't. There have been several studies that show that sleep deprivation causes insulin resistance. One study even showed that a single night of sleep deprivation induced insulin resistance in people who were healthy. So they were healthy before, they slept bad one night, and then they had those insulin resistance. It's pretty bad. And another study sleep-deprived men for just 4 days, and it reduced their ability to regulate their glucose by 23%. That's bad, okay? Sleep is clearly important here. As far as stress goes, we know that stress causes increases in the hormone cortisol, which can interfere with insulin's ability to do its job, okay? Cortisol also causes the liver to make more glucose for quick energy, and that makes the problem even worse because now you have more glucose in the blood and your body can't handle it, right? So getting enough high quality sleep is critical. I have a whole video on sleep optimization, so go to my channel if you finish this if you want to check it out. As for stress, if you got to find something that works for you. Personally, I like going for walks outside and doing breath work, specifically box breathing, works really well for me, but you just got to find a way to disconnect and relax, and whatever that is for you, it's going to help, okay? And so, yeah, you got to find a way to disconnect and relax, and it's going to be effective. Next habit here is getting sunlight. So increased bright light exposure is associated with a lower fasting insulin and lower HOMA-IR. And it turns out that vitamin D plays an important role in insulin sensitivity. So if you are deficient in vitamin D, then you're definitely going to be more likely to become insulin resistant. And you want to make sure that you're getting enough, ideally through the sun, right? And if you can't get enough from the sun, then you probably want to supplement with a vitamin D supplement, in addition to that. But the best place that we can get it is from the sun. And there are other benefits from getting the sun that are not vitamin D, right, from real sunlight, the different wavelengths of light that we get from it that help increase insulin sensitivity. Okay. Next is a concept called postprandial walks, which is a big, fancy, and obnoxious way of saying like you should go for a walk after you eat. Okay, so it's basically doing the same thing as exercise snacks, where it's bringing those glucose transporters to the surface of the cell more often and helping your muscle absorb more glucose. And the timing of this is right after your meal because we're doing it after meal because we just ate, and so our blood sugar is going to spike. When you eat food and it has carbohydrates in it or protein, you're going to get a glucose response. You're going to get some more glucose being absorbed, and so we're just helping our body more easily absorb that blood sugar and reduce the burden on insulin. Like we don't want insulin to have to overwork and do its job too much, right? It doesn't have to be a very long walk. You just go for 5 to 10 minutes. It's going to be fine, but you do want to do that within 30 minutes of eating. Okay, meal timing. When you eat your food does seem to matter quite a lot, which this was pretty surprising to me, honestly. At night, our insulin sensitivity goes down and insulin sensitivity goes up in the morning. And there have been several studies that have verified this. One even showed that people who eat more calories late in the night have a higher likelihood of developing insulin resistance than those who eat more calories in the morning. There's another study that showed that people who work the overnight shift are much more likely to become insulin resistant. Right? Bad news for you overnight nurse workers, right? Or shift workers. So there's definitely something there where eating late at night is not the best idea for insulin sensitivity. We think this may have to do with the hormone melatonin, which I'm sure a lot of you heard of, but it's a hormone that helps us regulate our circadian rhythm and helps us prepare for sleep, right? A lot of people will take it in supplement form, but melatonin actually decreases glucose tolerance. And so if we're eating more food at night when our body is producing more melatonin, then we're going to have worse insulin sensitivity as a result, and we're not going to be able to process our food as well, right? Our blood sugar remains high. That can impact your sleep. That can impact all of the other things that we talked about that insulin resistance does, okay? All right, so here's what you've all been waiting for: supplements and drugs, okay? Let's start with supplements. We've already talked about vitamin D, how that's important, but there's a group of minerals that are essential for optimal insulin function, and many people are deficient in them. Magnesium facilitates the action of insulin. Zinc is important for insulin storage and secretion, and chromium enhances insulin sensitivity, okay? And there have been several studies that have shown this. So if you're deficient in these minerals, you're more likely to become insulin resistant. However, supplementing may be a waste of your time and money if you have the right amounts of them, right? So I wouldn't recommend, just like blindly taking supplements until you get some blood work done and figure out if you may be deficient in these things, because we just don't know if they're going to help you, okay? The next supplement that you may have heard of, because it's got a lot of hype right now, is called berberine. Okay, people are calling it nature's Ozempic, which I think is absolutely ridiculous and a load of crap, because it definitely does not have the same weight loss effect as GLP-1 medications, but it can improve your insulin sensitivity, which is pretty cool. Basically, it can increase the number of insulin receptors that are available for insulin to do its job more effectively. It also activates a pathway called AMPK, which brings glucose transporters to the surface of the cell, okay, and reduces your blood sugar. Now, one of the downsides of berberine is it's not very bioavailable, meaning like when you take it in a supplement, most of it doesn't get absorbed, which is sad. So what scientists did, though, is they created a version of berberine called dihydroberberine. Okay? Now, dihydroberberine has much better bioavailability and is significantly more effective at a lower dose. Okay? And since you need to take a lower dose to get the same effect, it also has less gastrointestinal side effects. So highly recommend here. The effect size here is pretty significant. This study here showed that 500 milligrams of berberine 3 times a day with meals reduced A1C by 22%, which was 9.5 to 7.5, fasting glucose by 35%, and HOMA-IR by 44.7%. That is pretty awesome, and would definitely be worth considering taking if you are obviously consult your doctor, but would definitely be worth taking for someone who struggles with insulin sensitivity, okay? Next is cinnamon. This is the only one that actually tastes good, okay? But cinnamon has polyphenols that can have a similar effect as berberine to a lesser degree, of course. Berberine is definitely the most potent supplement that we have here, but cinnamon tastes good. So, you can add it to your stuff and get that get those polyphenols and have a decent positive blood sugar effect. There are others that can help too. Vitamin C, inositol, psyllium, which is a fiber, alpha-lipoic acid. All these have been shown to improve insulin sensitivity to a small degree. But really, again, nothing here is going to move the needle from a supplement perspective nearly as much as your minerals and berberine, so definitely start there. All right, what you've all been waiting for, drugs. Everyone loves drugs. Maybe not everybody. Some people hate drugs. We're about 50-50 in this country, I would say. I am in the middle here. I don't have a team I'm playing for. I'm just trying to relay you information, and a lot of people are taking some of these medications that I'm about to talk about. So we're going to dive into them because some of them may be of use for you, and some of them may not, but would be good education. So the first most popular drug is metformin. Okay, and metformin reduces glucose by essentially reducing glucose production by the liver and decreasing glucose absorption in the intestines. Okay, it also increases receptor sensitivity to insulin, so it kind of has a triple effect here. And since it both limits how much glucose your body's making and decreases how much you're absorbing from your food, it can be incredibly effective. Now, there is some evidence that can show that it can also have a longevity and like anti-aging effect, which is pretty awesome. Like if you can take this thing and it has little side effects and live longer, that'd be awesome, right? I don't 100% know if these studies are good yet. There have been several studies comparing, metformin to berberine, for example, in type 2 diabetics, and there seems to be like no significant difference in blood sugar, HOMA-IR, A1C between berberine and metformin. both significantly improve those metrics, and they do it by about the same degree. So like if you have to choose a supplement or a drug, I don't know, I'm probably leaning toward the supplement just personally, but there's just some interesting things going on there, and obviously metformin can be prescribed by your doctor. Okay. Now, this is one of those very, very rare occasions that this happens. Like most of the time, the natural version of something is not nearly as strong as a medication. So if you're not one that, again, loves the idea of medications, then I think berberine would be a better option for you. And if you want all the drugs, then sure, go for it. Metformin, it doesn't really seem to have very many side effects or downsides to it. And again, a lot of people are taking it for anti-aging and longevity purposes, and then living a long time. The only downside is that potentially metformin may hinder a little bit of muscle growth if that's part of your goal. So keep that in mind. Okay. Now, what's interesting here with metformin and berberine is that there have been a few studies and even a meta-analysis that looked at a combination of using both metformin and berberine together. And they found that the combination therapy was more effective than either metformin or berberine on their own at reducing blood sugar, HOMA-IR, and A1C. So that's pretty cool. It could be a new thing that people are doing, in the future, where they're using both of those in combination with each other to get the most effect and the most help if they're diabetic or pre-diabetic or just want better blood sugar control. Okay. All right. The next drugs we have here are your GLP-1 receptor agonists. Okay. And there are really two main GLP-1 receptor agonists here, right? The first one is semaglutide, and the second one is tirzepatide. So we've got these two drugs on the market: semaglutide, which is sold under the brand name Ozempic or Wegovy, and tirzepatide, which is sold as Zepbound or Mounjaro. Those are the two most common ones that you'll see. Semaglutide is a GLP-1 receptor agonist, which basically means it acts like GLP-1, which is a natural hormone released from the gut after you eat to increase feelings of satiety. Semaglutide also improves insulin sensitivity in a few ways. First, and most obvious, is that it helps people lose weight when they're not eating as much. And so when they lose weight, they become more insulin sensitivity. But it also stimulates the pancreas to release more insulin. Now you might be thinking, why the heck is that good? We already talked about how you don't want too much insulin in the blood, and that can lead to insulin resistance, right? And that's true. But semaglutide only causes more insulin to be released when blood sugar is elevated after you eat, which is really cool. It almost like determines when it needs to do that and have that function. It also suppresses the production of glucagon, which is a hormone that increases your blood sugar. So it has a pretty cool effect there. Obviously, there are some side effects with semaglutide, mostly gut related, and people feel horrible a lot of times taking it because it just makes you feel nauseous and miserable. And so, take with precaution if you're going to do it, of course, and always consult your doctor. And for a lot of people, these will just be, they won't be the best options. Let's just leave it at that. Most of those side effects are because people take inappropriate doses, though. I will say that. That brings us to tirzepatide, which is a GLP-1 receptor agonist and a GIP agonist. So it impacts two receptors instead of just one. Okay. Now, this dual action makes it far more effective for fat loss. The clinical trials showed that it was about double as good as semaglutide, where people on tirzepatide lost 20.2% of their starting body weight in the clinical trial on tirzepatide versus 13.7% on semaglutide. So it's far more effective for fat loss, but it also is more effective for insulin sensitivity. Now, there was a study here, which I'm showing, tirzepatide increased insulin sensitivity by 65.7% using the gold standard, the HEC, which we mentioned a little bit before, which is 20.5% better than semaglutide. Like, that's a huge difference. And now you may or may not know this, but there's a third generation of these drugs coming up. That's a triple agonist. And so it works on the GLP-1, the GIP, and glucagon receptors. Right? And so the clinical trials are still going on here, but they show even better results for fat loss, insulin sensitivity, even reductions in liver fat, and a whole host of other metabolic health metrics compared to even tirzepatide, which is better than semaglutide. So there's obviously a lot of promise here with these medications. There's obviously their fair share of downsides for sure. But it is important for you to be aware of just kind of what those options are and what they are, because a lot of people when using the right dose of these things are not having side effects, and they're getting really, really beneficial results for their overall health because they're able to do things like improve their insulin sensitivity and reduce body fat a lot more easily. Okay, so let's do a recap. We're calling this the Supercharge Your Cells protocol. Okay, step one is get assessed. If you don't know what you're dealing with, it's impossible to make the best game plan. So get your labs done, have someone assess your symptoms, and if you want us to help you with this, then you can start with the assessment that's linked in the description. I'm happy to help you. Okay. As far as labs goes, what you're looking for are a couple things: fasting insulin, fasting glucose, your HbA1c, triglycerides, and HDL, and then you can calculate your HOMA-IR from those scores like I taught you to do earlier. Okay. From a micronutrient perspective, you want to get your magnesium, RBC, which is in your red blood cell, zinc, vitamin D, and if you can get chromium, great, but that would be helpful as well. And then you're going to want to get your inflammatory markers checked as well. So, high sensitivity C-reactive protein, homocysteine, things will be helpful for you. Okay. If you want to go all out, it would be helpful to get your gut health tested too, because we do know that, poor gut health can lead to poor insulin sensitivity. And we talked about that a little bit with the probiotics and how those can help, but you don't want to go smashing random probiotics at yourself. You want to know really what's going on in your gut first. Okay. So get assessed. Step number 2 is to dial in your nutrition. So reduce ultra processed carbohydrates, obviously, and focus on whole fiber rich foods. Get enough protein and healthy fats. You can try intermittent fasting or early time restricted feeding, right? If you want to, shift most of your meals to the earlier part of the day, if that fits your lifestyle. It's not necessary, but it may help. Okay. Eat your food in the right order: fiber, protein, and then carbs, and then add foods that are rich in omega-3s, fermented foods, cinnamon, and antioxidants. Okay. Step number 3, exercise. Got to train smart. Okay. So we're going to lift weights 2 to 3 times per week to build muscle and improve our glucose storage capacity. We're going to do 60 to 90 minutes of zone 2 cardio and or 30 minutes of HIIT, which is high intensity interval training. Okay. And then try exercise snacks, 1 minute burst 3 to 6 times per day of an exercise that you can put a lot of intensity into. Okay. Last piece of exercise is we're going to walk after our meals for 5 to 10 minutes to improve our body's ability to handle glucose. Step number 4 is mastering your habits and recovery. So we're going to prioritize sleep. We know that one bad night wrecks insulin sensitivity. We're going to manage our stress with breath work, walk, sunlight exposure, anything we can really help you downregulate. And then we're going to make sure we don't eat foods too close to bedtime. Morning, most of our calories being in the morning or midday meals. Okay. Step number 5 is to use targeted support with supplementation and or drugs. Okay. And so, from a supplementation perspective, vitamin D, magnesium, zinc, chromium, and berberine, those are going to be your best. Dihydroberberine for even better absorption. Drugs like metformin, semaglutide, tirzepatide, retatrutide, these may be appropriate in some cases. And in combo with lifestyle, they can be very powerful tools. Okay, so you can definitely implement those and look into figuring out how that might work for you. The bottom line is improving insulin sensitivity is one of the best possible things that you can do for your body, your brain, and your health. But everyone's physiology is different. What works for you may not work for somebody else, and vice versa. And that's why I created the Cellular Blueprint Assessment. It's 100% free, and it's the best place to start to get an assessment of where you're at and what needs to change. All you do is you fill out the questionnaire, and then you select the time to meet with me to review your results. The link is in the description to get started, and if you found this valuable, drop a like and a comment, and I'll see you in the next one.